Conference of Mayors. City leaders gathered in San Juan, Puerto Rico last month, where C-SPAN's cameras recorded the session.
I'd like to call this meeting of the Hazardous Waste Workshop to order. I'm certainly pleased to see so many participants. I didn't quite know how to market a hazardous waste workshop to attract people in such a beautiful environment as we have here at our conference. We did send out little flyers. We considered sending out free samples, offering free samples of hazardous waste. And I don't know whether if EPA or the Department of Transportation will help us with that, but we can do that at the end of the meeting. I was asked to run a very tight meeting, a very controlled meeting, so first of all, let me set out the rules and regulations. Anyone wearing a tie or coat will be required to contribute to the Superfund. And that's one way that we can get an authorization in turning it into an appropriation. And Mr. Porter will collect that. Of course, he may be required to contribute here if he goes too much. Hazardous waste. It is an interesting subject, to say the least, certainly in regards to all the cities across the country. Oftentimes it's thought of in relation to something distant and far away, whether it be Chernobyl or Bhopal, perhaps something that doesn't attract or affect us in our own localities. But yet, as I think we have all found out, hazardous waste is as close to us as our neighborhood dry cleaners. It's as close to us as our local gas station. It's as close to us as the stronger than dirt aerosol can in our kitchen cabinet. So these are the issues that we're having to deal with as we learn not only the short-range effects of what we do upon our own health and safety, but also the long-range effects. And it truly is a national perspective that is best dealt with at the local level. So this brings into what I think is one of the most productive relationships that we can achieve between federal, state, and local. Oftentimes we often think of that as purely a financial relationship. And indeed it seems to be that way a lot of the time, and a lot of the dialogue that takes place between different levels of government has to do with who is going to get money from whom. But in this particular subject, I think that we can see from some of the successes and from some of the challenges that we face, the possibility of some good working relationships between all levels of government. And the task is so large that I think we will see that it's that type of relationship that we have to achieve if we're going to have any type of success. How do we measure the success? Actually, it's pretty easy if we're successful. It's whether we're healthy or not. It's not a question of frills, it's a question of life safety. It's of the highest priority, I think, on a nationwide level. And as we have also discovered, though, it's not merely something that is unique to the United States, but is of international proportions. And truly, what we do affects our neighbor and vice versa. We have a very good workshop today, a very interesting one. We have two distinguished guest speakers who will talk about this productive relationship between the federal government and localities. But prior to going into that, what I would like to do would be to ask some of the mayors and elected representatives that are here in this workshop to perhaps discuss their own local situation. As we have found, one of the most beneficial results from conferences such as these is to learn about the particular circumstances of neighboring communities and how they have met their various challenges, what problems have come up, and they are always problems that you least expect, and they always happen on the weekends too, I've found out. I don't know why that happens, but that's just the rules of the game. So with that, if I might be so presumptuous to start out and maybe discuss a little bit about Anchorage, Alaska. I'm the mayor of Anchorage, and as all elected officials are, I certainly am proud of my city and what it's done and what a great place it is to live. But that does not mean that we do not have challenges and problems with hazardous waste. And in fact, I think I'm very optimistic about our ability to meet those, because people that live in Alaska consider that something so foreign to what the reason that they live in a place like Alaska to be is to be threatened by hazardous waste, that they're willing to not sweep it under the rug, but in a very encouraging situation, rolling up their sleeves and getting down to doing the very hard but practical but also productive efforts of doing the job. We are not a large industrial location in Anchorage, Alaska. We're basically a headquarters city, being a hub of transportation services, distribution throughout the state, financial, legal, a headquarters city for developments that take place throughout the state. But yet we have been heavily impacted by hazardous waste in recent times. One of the most notable recently was the discovery along a creek that runs through the center of town, which is the main source of our water supply currently, and is also the spawning grounds for 3 different runs of salmon, to discover that a junkyard, which has been located for a number of decades adjacent to that stream, had a level of PCBs that caused the EPA to come in and declare it a disaster area. We worked with our own local health department and in cooperation with the State Department of Environmental Conservation and with the EPA, have gone in, have sealed off the site, and have begun through the Superfund efforts to go about cleaning it up. And I think it can become an example of how to a surprising situation that has really been a time bomb in the community for a number of years, unbeknownst to anyone, discovered, but through cooperation and through the forward thinking of Congress to funding a project such as the Superfund, go about cleaning it up. I would also note that the U.S. Conference of Mayors was on record early, prior to the Superfund ever being initiated, as supporting such a program to help cities work out a solution. Another area that came up recently was in one of our outlying districts of the municipality of Anchorage. People started, and through served by local wells, noticed that they were had a higher octane level in their drinking water than they desired. While that may have given them a little more energy, they didn't particularly like the taste. They turned it into our State Department of Environmental Conservation for testing, and our local health department, and it was found that there was indeed benzene in the water. And while we have not located the specific source, it is a suspected underground gasoline tank that leaked from a number of years back. Again, a case not of someone willfully polluting the environment, but just an accidental situation where prior to there being regulations or really knowledge of the situation, that an underground storage tank of gasoline has leaked into the aquifer. We have worked very closely with the state, and I think in a very fast-moving cooperation of both the financial and regulatory and health departments within both jurisdictions, that we have put in a temporary water supply within 14 days. We put an emergency water supply the very day that it was discovered through the National Guard. It affected some 115 homes. We put up some water tanks. We installed a temporary water system connecting all of the residences within 14 days, and have gone through an election assessment district to provide municipal water to this area, which will be in effect this fall before freeze-up. Admittedly, at the election time, they didn't have much choice, because as of freeze-up, the lines which are now currently plastic lines running above ground wouldn't function. Still, there were some people that voted against it, and I don't quite understand why. They must not use very much water. But these are two examples of hazardous waste, again, in a community that really prided itself on not really having any. Over the years, in the last 4 years, we have gone through an enormous amount of attention to hazardous waste. Old transformers used in electrical distribution are a prime source of PCBs in the community, and how to dispose of that, again, is a source of pollution that most people don't realize is even there. One of the most important aspects of dealing with hazardous waste, as we have come to find out, and it's something I certainly personally have learned, is getting community involvement. And if there was one thing I could emphasize in community involvement, is the importance of activating that part of your program early. Not because people will fight the program. In fact, I think, as we have found out, that they're enormously supportive of it and will be helpful in finding out solutions. What they are requesting to know is something that indeed they have the right to know, and we have some model ordinances that have gone forward of what hazardous waste there are in the community. It's not only the citizens' right to know, but I think it's elected officials' responsibility to know where they are and how to deal with them. And you will find an enormous amount of cooperation in dealing with hazardous waste. We have a voluntary cleanup program twice a year, and people are now putting in thousands of gallons of hazardous waste, which previously one can only imagine went either into the sewer system illegally or just poured out on the ground. But people are voluntarily bringing it in a responsible way because they want to contribute, and they take the extra time and effort. It's always easier to pour something on the ground if you're not caught. But they're taking this extra effort on their part because they want to be a contributor to cleaning up the environment. We've had a lot of success, and it's because of these successes that I think that we can be optimistic. I will now cease my filibuster at this point, as there's no motion on the table, and I would like to call upon some of the other mayors and elected officials that are here today with us, and maybe they can discuss some of the successes and challenges in their community. And I might start off with Peggy Messinger from Modesto, California, and who is the Vice Chair of the Energy and Environment Committee and on Air Quality. Peggy, thank you for coming. Let me ask you to speak there into the microphone.
When Mayor Knowles mentioned dry cleaners, he struck a familiar note, because I think the biggest challenge we have had so far in our city stems from that very commonplace kind of operation. In a redevelopment project downtown, where we're building a community center over a 2-block area, we have already removed 16 underground storage tanks. One of them, from a dry cleaner, contained Stoddard solvent, which had leaked. And while this, I understand, is not toxic, it is hazardous. And it had migrated 60 feet down to 1 water level. It is not the level from which our drinking water comes, but we viewed it as a potential threat because we do pump our water out of the ground for domestic purposes. And so we've been getting a very liberal and expensive education in the cost of leaking underground storage tanks. We immediately went to work and hired an engineering firm which installed a rather innovative system. It has achieved excellent results in terms of reducing the pollution. It's a process that involves recirculating the material through a bacterial treatment, and eventually the bacteria apparently consume the solvent. One of the problems, though, is that the state is reluctant to tell us when we have reached a point that is considered acceptable. And of course, it's important to us to get some kind of definite assurance from the state that we have done the job necessary. We have spent so far over $600,000. It is coming out of our water fund because we feel that this particular expenditure is aimed at protecting our water supplies. And we hope that we can soon get clearance from the state and consider the job accomplished. Certainly the significance is that this business of leaking underground storage tanks has tremendous potential, and that the costs are very significant for dealing with them. And yet, if we are to protect our water supplies and our citizens, we are going to have to see that the cleanup is accomplished. In our case, the land was publicly owned, although obviously the operation had been conducted under private auspices, but there was no way of going back to previous owners for assistance. And those are all questions I'm sure that the EPA is struggling to deal with in a way that is equitable and still effective. In other respects related to hazardous and toxic waste, we have had one big private cleanup of some contaminated bricks, but that was taken care of totally by the business firm responsible for the problem, and they certainly handled it very quickly and, again, at a great deal of expense, but that was taken care of. The message is that we have a big bill to pay for the many years that we have had the benefits of a chemical society. We're now certainly having an accounting when we don't know how much, I guess, the final result will be.
Thank you very much. Well said. Thank you for your observations. Would next like to introduce Ann Dreeman from Alameda, California. Mayor. I'm sorry, I think I mispronounced your name, Ann. Diamond.
Everyone does, don't you? Well, we have had the experience of a military installation in Alameda. It takes up over a third of our main island. It's been there for more than 40 years. And again, it's one of those situations where people never meaningfully or intentionally dumped hazardous waste. They simply dumped because they had a need to dump, and in this case, the EPA, when it came in, found, I believe, 4 dump sites that were in question. It's a very emotional issue if you have been locally involved with this issue, and I'm sure a lot of you here have. It's a question, if you're a mayor, of wanting to do what's possible without shouting fire in a crowded theater. And for this reason, I would make a strong request to the EPA that when they do investigations and get answers of this type, that they should work with the local government. Our experience was that I had calls from several different local newspapers asking about my reaction to this situation and what I was going to do about it. And when I did not get overly excited about it, then I began to get letters in the newspaper asking why I was not. I'm sure that others of you have. I talked to the mayor of Carson, California this morning, and he reported a similar problem. I think Tony mentioned model ordinances, and we looked at that type of a thing. Unfortunately, in California, we have had a dreadful situation with liability insurance, and the city presently is without any insurance, as are many others. Therefore, we decided that we were not going to be liable for these kind of things, and we are working with the county in our case and our fire department works very closely with them. But there are a lot of unanswered problems still. Mentioned underground tanks. We have had to put a very large sum in our budget for this next fiscal year for the 14 or 15 underground tanks the city is responsible for. And so we're facing it on all angles. And that's my part of the story, Tony.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Appreciate it. Also understand Bob Wagner from the mayor of Lakewood, California is here. Bob, do you have any comments?
Thank you. I don't have any horror stories, fortunately, but we're, of course, primarily concerned down in our area with the contamination of water, for example, in the area, and so we're particularly concerned about the disposal of hazardous waste and coming up with a resolution of that issue so that we, in fact, don't end up with contaminated water from contamination in areas that perhaps we don't even have control over. One of the specific instances that we have that's dealt with this topic that was a little bit disconcerting in our area has to do with a major corporation that was planning an expansion in the area, and as part of the expansion, they were going to considerable lengths to actually improve their methods of handling hazardous waste. And in spite of the fact that this was going to be a major improvement in the area, a lot of the residents became very concerned about the expansion from that standpoint. And so I think one of the major problems that we have in this area is that there's been so much negative publicity and so much scare that's been introduced that oftentimes, even when you're trying to do something beneficial, it can be met with very substantial opposition simply because of the very negative reaction that you get from people. So I think this is one of the things that we need to keep in mind in dealing with the problem. Another instance of this has to do with how you dispose of waste, and we're still having problems with waste-to-energy type disposal systems in the general area of Southern California, and resistance of people, in some cases elected officials, to that kind of disposal. So it would seem that if these kinds of plants, waste-to-energy plants, in fact, can be done can be built in a safe way, then we should also be getting some kind of publicity from the EPA, for example, or other major organizations that, in fact, indicate that. If they can't, and if we need to have something different, then perhaps we need to have some additional money poured into the research areas so that we can, in fact, develop that kind of an effective disposal of waste. Because basically, it appears to me right now is we simply don't have any place that you can safely dispose of hazardous waste. In Southern California, every time we turn around, the places that we are using are being closed down or are in the process of effectively being closed down. And pretty soon, we're going to have everybody simply dumping it simply because there isn't any effective place to get rid of the waste. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor Wagner. Appreciate those comments. I see that Jim Van Arsdale from Billings, Montana is here. Mayor Van Arsdale, welcome to the Hazardous Waste Workshop.
Thank you very much. And of course, the reason I came is to learn all I can about hazardous waste. I've had experience along several lines. I happen to be sitting on a board of a hospital that has nuclear medicine, and we are very aware of what we need to do with that hazardous waste as far as inventorying and make sure that it is shipped out. We have 3 refineries in our Billings area, and those folks have a program of disposing their hazardous waste. And you mentioned a while ago, Tony, about the PCB. We had a very sad experience of PCB contaminating a chicken processing plant, and that plant is out of business today. And at one time it employed 100 and some folks, so it really did cause a economic crisis, so to speak, when that went out of business. I'm concerned about mining and the need for monitoring mining. We get our water out of the Yellowstone River, and there are becoming more and more mines upstream from our city. And I think there's a need for very close monitoring on the mining operations in our state. Also, when I float our rivers, I think one of the things that gets me most is the agricultural contamination of our streams. And we get our water out of the streams, and I think that rancher and farmer, I realize he's hard-pressed right now, but the contamination caused by his operation and neglect of our ecology, I think, has to be addressed. Another thing that I am concerned about is the 2 interstate highways and the railroad that goes through our city, and what is transported up and down both those transportation ways. And I think those folks, and I'm sure the BN has perhaps safety rules and regulations to control how fast the train pulling a white car through our city travels, but I'm not sure of that, and that's why I'm here. And I'm looking forward to some more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate it. One comment I would like to make, I'd like to congratulate all the mayors and elected officials on being so well behaved today. Nobody has made any fishing stories yet, and so we haven't had to compete on that line. Particularly, I'd like to thank Mayor Messinger for not, and Mayor Diamond for not telling their fishing stories again. Actually, particularly the mayor from Montana. They think they have big trout there. But no, wait a minute. We're pleased to have Mayor Brian O'Toole from Sunnyvale, California. Mayor O'Toole, if you'd care to make any comments.
I promised no fishing stories, so we do have a little bit of land on the bay. We're quite concerned about hazardous materials in Sunnyvale and in Santa Clara County. As you may know, Sunnyvale is the heart of Silicon Valley. What was once thought to be a very clean industry, we're finding out is not quite as clean as we had once envisioned. Santa Clara County is the home of, I believe, 42 Superfund sites, and we are very, very concerned about groundwater contamination, because the citizens of Sunnyvale get about 1/3 of their water from groundwater. Last Sunday, I did something that I do every few months. I ride along with our public safety department. We have a combined police and fire department, and our public safety department handles hazardous materials response. And so I went riding along with the hazmat unit last Sunday afternoon. They had a drum that was unidentified. They didn't know what was in it, and they wanted to test it to make sure that there were no hazardous or toxic materials. The methods they used were quite sophisticated. They have a huge truck, which is really a rolling laboratory, and they got a sample from this drum and took it into their truck, and they analyzed it and determined that it was, in fact, not hazardous. But in talking with them, one of the problems that they brought up was how little effort there is in training hazardous materials response teams. they've put together their manuals and their procedures. It's kind of a catch-as-catch-can approach. And what they were most concerned about is finding training on a national basis or even a statewide basis where they can get an organized approach to responding to hazardous materials emergencies. And one of the issues that I hope Mr. Porter will address, or someone, is how can we build expertise on a local level so that our own individual cities can respond quickly to these hazardous threats. And how can we build that expertise on a consistent basis so that we all have access to it? And I don't think money is really the issue, because I know that in Sunnyvale, and I believe in other cities, the city councils are willing to front the money to get this training. The issue isn't money, the issue is leadership. And we've got to have leadership to provide the training necessary to build expertise in this area. So I hope that's an issue we address, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mayor O'Toole. Very timely comments, and I would note that prior to Mr. Porter's remarks, that the Conference of Mayors is on record, at least through the Resolutions Committee, requesting just exactly such technical assistance from the EPA, which will be important. Let me ask now if Mr. Lou Piltz from La Mirada, a council member from La Mirada, California. Welcome.
The first thing I'd like to say is that we've had 4 or 5 cities from California and only one from out of state. All the garbage is not in California. But that doesn't mean we're not concerned, as has been stated by the other individuals that came up here. We had one unfortunate incident about 5 or 6 years ago that wasn't even in our city, but was right next door on our borderline, a city to the west of us. Barrels of contaminants that have been stored there for a long time on private property, and finally someone or somehow they set fire to it, and of course the residue and the smoke was all drifting in our direction because that's the prevailing winds. It was cleaned up, and there was a great effort by government agencies, federal, state, county, local, health department, and everything. Everyone worked together very well. It was cleaned up, and we found that there was no contamination in the ground next door, so it has been taken care of. But on the other side of us, to the east, there is a problem with what's called, I think it's Capri, or it's in Fullerton. Is it the Capri? No, well, it's a dump site, that former dump, McCall dump site that's still there, that they have held off working on. There has been money set aside, Superfund money, but for whatever reasons, they haven't started working on it. It's out of our jurisdiction, of course. But that's a concern for everyone. And I would hope that one of the things that I see in a lot of cases, and that I'd like to bring to mind to everyone, is that we have our own areas, our own cities to protect, our own citizens to protect, but more importantly, we have to work together. And I think we are in California, because we can't say you can't put a plant here, or you can't put a refuse-to-energy plant here, or you can't because it's too close to us. Put it in someone else's backyard. We need it, but put it in someone else's backyard. We have to realize somewhere along the line we all have to accept our responsibilities. And in California, you have a lot of organizations working towards that, too. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Councilman. I appreciate your remarks on that. We all have NIMBYs in our own communities. That's not in my backyard. People, and that truly we are our neighbor's keeper, and that's a very good point. Are there any other mayors and elected officials that I have overlooked? Yes.
I just wanted to make a comment about people, the average citizen's knowledge regarding hazardous waste. We don't realize how many things there are that are toxic that are of household use. And one of the problems that we're facing right now is we would like to sponsor a hazardous waste cleanup of household toxic things, But the liability situation in California is so bad that no one is willing to sponsor that kind of a cleanup because of perhaps being liable for some accident that might occur on the way, or, you know, with joint and several liability, you never know who gets caught. But I understood that at one time there was some discussion about providing an underwriting pool at the federal level that would help to deal with the problems of liability insurance. And if it could even be done in terms of some of these toxic waste so that we could sponsor community-wide cleanups, it would seem to me that that would be helpful and would certainly aid us in not in disposing of this instead of having it dumped, because as you point, when it gets so expensive that you have to truck it far, far away, it will be dumped.
That's a very good point, and maybe Dr. Porter can address that in his discussion. Thank you for bringing that up. Household toxic waste truly are probably one of the single greatest source of contaminants nationwide. It's not some factory that's sitting out there doing that, but your own cabinet. It's my pleasure. We have two distinguished guests here today who will help educate us on hazardous waste and how to deal with them. Prior to introducing them, let me discuss first of all this beautiful map here on my right. Let me first say that most mayors are very sensitive if they're not included on a map, and at first I thought that was a map of the funding of DOT for next year. And I would note that neither Alaska nor our wonderful host city of San Juan are located on that map. And then I read the title of it and I saw hazardous materials truck traffic, and I must admit I won't protest our not being on that map. Here to explain that map today is Miss Cynthia Douglas, who is an administrator of the Research and Special Programs Administration of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And she works directly for Secretary Dole in running the department's responsibilities in the areas of hazardous materials transportation and pipeline safety. I think as everyone who is familiar with hazardous waste knows that the most critical link in the successfully dealing with hazardous waste is the transportation, and that is the point indeed of the most danger and the biggest problems to local communities. Ms. Douglas was a senior staff member of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and she worked for Senator John Danforth of Missouri. And with that, please welcome Ms. Douglas from the Department of Transportation, who will explain that map. Thank you.
Okay. Do you want me to explain the map and make my remarks?
Please make your remarks, and if there are perhaps some questions concerning that map, however you'd like to handle it.
Okay. Okay, I wasn't sure if you wanted when to go first or me, so I'm ready to go. I will explain that map. This map is based on the census data, and it is a flow chart of the hazardous materials truck traffic, and the primary point of that map is that you will see that hazardous materials really are flowing all over the United States. Now those red lines are I couldn't believe it when it came in red, but the red lines are the interstate, are primarily the interstate systems, and most of the hazardous materials transportation is going over the interstate system, and if you're located along that line, you probably should make planning for an accident a priority. Of course, hazardous materials are all over the United States. Gasoline tank cars are in every community, and those are, in fact, in terms of the accident statistics, gasoline tank trucks have the highest, cause our biggest problem with death and injury. So anyway, that sort of explains the map. The purpose of the map is to just show you that hazardous materials of all types are being transported all over this country. And now let me go back to my presentation, my basic presentation. I am with the Research and Special Programs Administration, and we do, my agency does have several important responsibilities. And one of those is hazardous materials transportation, and that includes nuclear transportation. We also have responsibility for pipeline safety. I've been with the department about 2 years now, and I feel like I have made a number of significant changes in the way we are trying to address some of these problems, and I'll talk about those in just a moment. I wanted to tell you that hazardous materials transportation has been done safely in this country. We do have about 250 million shipments a year, and with that we have had about an average of under 10 deaths a year due to hazardous materials transportation. Nonetheless, it is it can be a very dangerous and hazardous, present a very dangerous and hazardous problem to communities. For example, the substance that was involved in the Bhopal, India, that substance is transported not in great quantity in the United States, but it is transported. But there are other chemicals that are just as dangerous as that, and they are transported, and they are done under rules and regulations that the Department of Transportation has for packaging, for driver qualifications, for routing. There are a variety of requirements that the people transporting these dangerous goods do have to follow, and we are constantly upgrading those regulations. However, it is essential that every community in this country do some planning for a hazardous materials accident. Now, I want to say that I believe, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think of hazardous materials transportation, what I think of as our responsibility at the federal level. I believe that hazardous materials transportation has to be a true partnership between the federal and the state and the local and the private sector. The federal government cannot handle hazardous materials transportation by itself. We can have rules and regulations, but we need the state's help on enforcement. We need the private sector's help on compliance, and we need, and in fact, technical information, and we need the local help. The local level needs to do planning, and the private sector and the federal and the state can all help with that in various ways, but the local governments are the ones that have to do the planning. You're the ones that have to figure out what kind of risks your area has. You have to coordinate fire departments, emergency services. You have to assess what equipment is available in your community to deal with these accidents. And there just are many things that can only be done by you at the local level. So my basic philosophy, what I have tried to do since I have come to the Department of Transportation, is look at who should be responsible for what and where we can help each other. And then the next thing that I've tried to do is I've really tried to get our little agency, which is very small, I have tried to expand our communications. I found when I came to the department that we had almost a circle the wagons sort of attitude within RSPA, and I feel and strongly that we have to go out and do a much better job of communicating. We have to better communicate, well, first within the Department of Transportation, and we have put some things into place to help that. We also have to better communicate with our sister agencies and departments that have responsibilities in hazardous materials transportation, EPA and FEMA and Department of Defense and Department of Energy and Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I mean, it is extremely, I think it's just terrible for people out in the states and local to try to deal with the federal government. You have a very difficult time knowing who is going to be responsible for what at the federal level and who to call, and it seems like everybody's pointing to the other person, and that is something that I have a personal commitment to trying to see if we can't get that straightened out. And then we need to better communicate with the states and with the local governments. When I came, I found in the pipeline safety program is an excellent little program within the department. And what they have done for 10 years is have regional workshops. Our federal people go out. The country was divided into like 5 regions, and our federal people, about 5 or 6 people, the regulatory, the enforcement, the training people, the lawyer, they go out and they meet on a regional basis with the people in the state who are responsible for pipeline safety. They sit around a table, they discuss everything. Everybody knows what's going on. We know what the state problems are. The state knows what we're trying to accomplish. They know what we're planning for in rulemaking. They let us know what training they need. I found that was not being done in hazardous materials transportation, and there was no real relationship between the federal and the state, much less the local government. So we have established and started this year a set of several different workshops. We have had with FEMA and with EPA some emergency response workshops on a regional basis. We have completed, and we will hold these every year. We have just completed our year of hazardous materials transportation workshops, and we are getting ready this fall to start our nuclear transportation regional workshops. And the workshops have been going very well, and I am very think that those will help out a lot, help in our relationship quite a bit. Then I wanted to mention that in the rulemaking area, the Department of Transportation has a number of very significant rules underway that I think you'll be interested in. One, and I noticed in your resolutions, one of our rules is the driver qualification rule, and we would like your comments on that. So in Washington, if you all individually or as a conference mayors, if you could send in your comments on our driver qualification rule for hazardous materials truck drivers, that would be very helpful to us. That rule will do a number of things. It will have prohibit multiple licensing, and it will have it will have prohibitions, of course, on driving under the influence, but it'll have some provisions to help do testing of drivers and to give guidelines as to what should be done if somebody is driving under the influence. I was just involved in a conversation with some people on Capitol Hill on the House Public Works Committee, and they're working on a bill right now along these lines. And right now they were saying that they were trying to decide whether the thought was that you caught one time and your license should be suspended for like 3 years or something to drive a truck, and that if you do it again, then you know. Well, I sat there and I said, and maybe I'm being a little too strong, but I'm not sure somebody that's caught drinking and driving should ever drive a hazardous materials truck again. You know, there's a public trust. You're letting somebody drive a truck is a dangerous enough vehicle, and then a hazardous materials truck on top of that. And if you're drinking or under the influence of drugs, I mean, I think that should be it. But anyway, those issues will be debated and everything. But that's a very significant rule that we have underway at the Department of Transportation. We are right now exploring the driver training requirements, and our driver training requirements are very vague, and in my opinion they're too vague, and I think some other people would probably agree with that. But anyway, we are looking at those, and we are going to update and upgrade those driver training rules. We are also in the process of trying to figure out how we can make all of these rules priority rules and get the staff to take care of these rules. But we are also, another high priority rule, in my opinion and in the staff's opinion, is highway routing. We have a highway routing rule for nuclear transportation. It's worked, I think, very, very well. We want to look at a similar rule for hazardous materials, or for at least the extremely hazardous materials. That kind of a rule will not tell us exactly which highways they're on, but it will probably tend to get the hazardous materials onto the interstate primarily. And I have just gotten a letter from the International Bridge, Turnpike, and Tunnel Authority. They are going to do a study, a flow study of all of the turnpikes and tunnels, bridges, tunnels under their authority, of the significant hazardous materials that are going through, and they intend, of course, to release that information to the communities once they have completed their study. And they asked for our help and assistance in that regard, and I wrote them back, and in fact called them immediately and said, "This is terrific. We really will be glad to help you in that regard." So that is something that will help identify the flows in the United States. Another thing that we have going on right now that I have sort of referred to a little bit, but we are working with EPA and with FEMA on laying out who is responsible for what activity in the emergency response area at the federal level. I don't know the format that will take. It could be a memorandum of understanding. It could be some other document. But I think that it's very important that we, first of all, lay out who is responsible for what, and let you all know who is responsible for what. At that point, we can identify if there are any gaps in responsibilities, and make sure that those gaps are filled, and we can't afford the overlaps. So that process is underway, and I think it's a very important and very significant process. Another thing that the Secretary of Transportation has just announced is that she is going to take the responsibility to make sure that an information clearinghouse is set up. And that will involve a toll-free telephone number, probably to the Department of Transportation. And the idea is that local officials and state officials who are doing planning can call that number and find out where they can get the information that they feel that they need. For example, if a community is just getting started on planning, I would think that we would refer them to the CARE program. I don't know if any of you have heard of the CARE program, but I want to mention this program. It's a private sector initiative. The Chemical Manufacturers Association has put it together, and they have put together a document on how to do planning at the state and local level, or at the local level. They have sent this document to all of their chemical plant managers. They have asked their plant managers to contact the mayors of the town that they're located in and set up hazardous materials advisory councils and begin doing the planning that's needed in a community. Now, that doesn't reach, that CARE program has only reached those communities with plant managers, and only those communities, again, where the plant managers have cooperated. But soon we are expanding. In fact, this month CMA is linking up with the General Federation of Women's Clubs. There are 20,000 women's clubs across the country, and CMA is going to work with the women's clubs and train them and give them all this material and offer the CMA's help. And then all these women's clubs are going to be supposed to contact the mayors. So that should be, I would imagine that group will probably really get good planning going. But anyway, that's a significant and important step, I think. Also, this information clearinghouse, what I think we will be able to do is pull together a great deal of information. We may point somebody to CMA, a name and a telephone number at CMA, and they can talk with them about the CARE program. I want to pull together information on training and what training courses exist. FEMA may decide under our agreement that FEMA will want to take on that responsibility. So we may point you to a person at FEMA, or if FEMA doesn't want to take on that responsibility, we will make sure that we, DOT, will make sure that something gets done. But anyway, I want to make sure that all of the training courses that we know of in the United States are listed on a computer, and what kind of training, and as much information as we can get, maybe the cost, and that way when you go out and do your planning and figure out what materials are coming through, if you have a lot of dimethyl kumquat, or something, you can call us up and say, hey, what do you have on dimethyl kumquat, and we may be able to point you again in a useful direction. So anyway, I think that an information clearinghouse would be very helpful. Also, I brought it with me because I think you'll find it. The CMA, the Chemical Manufacturers Association, has put together this group of teams, emergency response teams. They're called ChemNet. And this is a map. It's not a big map, but you may want to look at it more closely. These are emergency response teams, and this is what CMA has told me. These teams will be fully equipped and fully trained to handle any hazardous material accident. Now, that's good, but the problem is that there are about 63 or 65 chemical companies so far that have joined ChemNet. So when there's an accident and a community calls a number, a toll-free telephone number, Chemtrec, they will know, these teams will be activated if the community wants the teams. Well, the problem is that there are two problems, and I'm working to try to see if we can't work with the private sector to get a resolution. One is that they only will respond to accidents of a company that's a member of ChemNet, and not all companies are members of ChemNet. So we've got to get, first step is we've really got to get every company that we can joined up to this ChemNet. And second, I think that this will happen. I'm trying to encourage, I want the CMA to be more communicative about the locations of ChemNet, because right now, see, one thing that could happen is, let's say you're here and let's say I'm from Kansas, so I'll use Topeka, Kansas. Let's say you're in Topeka, Kansas, and there's a team there. Now, is there any reason that if I were the mayor of Topeka, I couldn't go to the team and say, okay, you're going to respond if it's any of these 60 companies, but I want you to respond in the case of any accident. I've talked to a number of people, and I don't see how a company that's located or has a team in Kansas could refuse to. I don't see why they would refuse to. I mean, there is a liability issue, but maybe you work that out with them. Maybe you contract with that team for X amount of money. I don't know, but I think that these teams are going to be very important to your emergency response planning, because if you've got the knowledge and the people and the equipment right there, why duplicate it? I mean, if it's adequate and if it's good. So what I'm trying to do is working with the private sector. I'm trying to get a real, true national set of emergency response teams that could be on the scene within no more than a few hours. And I think that will help help our situation. So anyway, that information is something that I also plan on putting on into this information clearinghouse. And then you may have to take the next step and contact the team and ask them what arrangements you can make with them.
Maybe if you can, let me, there's another mayor that just came in, and then we got Dr. Porter we covered, and then the rest of it are questions and answers.
Okay.
Should that be all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I have another mayor that has come to visit us, and Mr. Michael O'Loughlin from Niagara Falls, the mayor of Niagara Falls. Welcome, Mr. Mayor, and if you have any comments on hazardous waste, would appreciate. You do not have to contribute to the Superfund as you're wearing shorts.
Well, I rose to the occasion and came to this meeting instead of staying home for the emergency drill that was held yesterday.
If we could ask you maybe to speak to the microphone there.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor. Just a word, and then if there's anything you want to follow from that, but everyone feels that they're the number one in football and basketball and everything else, and unfortunately, I think that Niagara Falls has been designated number one, not because they wanted it, but because of the fate that befalls communities. And there's lots of details on it that we've had in the problem of hazardous waste, and that we have two the technical or disposal places of hazardous waste in Western New York at this time, an SCA and a NUCO or BFI disposal area. Since probably just want me to say a word or two, I can say to a community, it is very, very trying, very, very difficult for those in charge of the city, extremely spurs extreme questions on the part of the populace and is very expensive. And we can talk about EPA, DOT, and our own DEC and our own state and the like, but it ends up with every time something is done, the community still has to pay some. And we find it very demanding. It was mentioned by Ms. Douglas here that the Hazardous Waste Advisory Council, and we do have one. And I did speak to the Chemical Manufacturers Association of Washington on the Hazardous Waste Advisory Council that Niagara Falls has. And I think it is a very good procedure for a community that has hazardous waste or toxic problems within the community. It is not a dual organization, one that digs the holes and tests the soil, but it is one that is a forum for educating the public. And not only does it educate the public, but it educates the people concerned, including the ones who are on that. And I'm chairman of our Hazardous Waste Advisory Council. I think it's very good, and one of its missions was to hold its emergency drill, which was held yesterday, and I feel ashamed not being there, but it's tough to be at two places at one time. You got to weigh Puerto Rico versus hazardous waste, so you take a look. So you do your duty when you have to there. But it's a problem that is not going to go away. It's a problem that the country and the community are going to beat, but it's going to be very demanding, particularly for some communities versus others that will have nothing like it. In the state of New York, Niagara Falls has had a financial hemorrhage for about 8 years, since August the 2nd, 1978. And it has really bled the financial city dry. Adjoining communities, adjoining being 50 miles away or so, and thereon, can be enjoying relative economic success. Not because they're doing better or managed better, but because they don't have this drain that has to continually go on. So if you have a problem, I can say good luck to you, God bless, because you're not going to need both. You're also going to need some money someplace. And the other one is to keep a constant education of the people, which comes about through this advisory materials, Hazardous Waste Advisory Council. Yes. And so with that, thank you very much. If there's anything I can help with there, I want to learn myself, too.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your comments and certainly for your leadership in this important subject for all cities. So appreciate it.
Can I say just one
Sure.
quick thing? I brought, but I didn't, I brought a film, that DuPont film. Have you seen that wonderful film on Hazardous Materials Advisory? You all are featured in there.
Yes.
And I brought that film, and I would be glad, it's a tape, and I'd be glad to leave it with Glenn. And if anybody wants to see it, it is a great film on planning and why you need to do planning and how to do it. It's 19 minutes. It is great.
It is.
Thank you. Our next speaker, prior to going into a question and answer session, is a real expert in the field of hazardous waste. Dr. J. Winston Porter is the Assistant Administrator for Solid Waste and Emergency Response for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. He has a very long background, scientific background. He received his doctorate in chemical engineering from the University of California at Berkeley, worked for 10 years as a vice president for Bechtel Construction and Engineering Corporation in Saudi Arabia, and has also worked in his own business for 10 years prior to his appointment to EPA. Let me just maybe make one comment. The EPA is often looked upon as a regulatory agency only, but that is indeed changing today thanks to the leadership of people like Dr. Porter, who are truly bringing about a sense of partnership, solutions rather than just regulation. And that's a very welcome message to communities that are really struggling to find solutions and to cross over jurisdictional boundaries. So it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Porter, who's been personally very helpful to me as he advised me that sunscreening, if applied lightly to the nose, is not a hazardous waste. Thank you, Dr. Porter.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to be fairly brisk because I know you've got a lot of things you want to talk about. I'm in charge of basically 3 programs at EPA. One is Superfund, which I'm sure you've all heard about. The other is RCRA, and I won't use too many acronyms, but RCRA is Resources Conservation and Recovery Act, and I will explain more about that in a minute. And the third is the Chemical Emergency Preparedness Program. So what I'm in charge of doing is basically looking at past problems, such as Superfund problems, looking ahead, because what RCRA does, RCRA is the sort of cradle-to-grave system to control hazardous waste in this country. And then finally, the Chemical Emergency Preparedness Program is the more instantaneous part. That is the kind of accidents and things which Ms. Douglas talked about that we all have to be concerned about. So what I'm going to do is take just a few minutes today and take you through each of those 3, and I'll try to weave it in a little bit to the local level, because I think you're sort of where the action is, and we want to talk about that. With respect to Superfund, let me take just a minute and sort of explain the process to you a little bit. You've probably heard some of this, but I think it's important because you're at the sort of end of an inverted funnel that's going to bring all this stuff down on your shoulders. In the last 5 years in Superfund, we have inventoried, or have an inventory at EPA, of 23,000 sites that we've looked at, have been brought to our attention around the country, and we now have in our database 23,000 potential Superfund sites. 16,000 of those have been assessed in one way or the other by EPA in the states, and have been, we've been able to find out there's other methods of handling besides Superfund. About 5,000 of those 16,000 have actually had on-site studies. A number of them with paper studies of what the problems are have led us to believe there is no issue that we need to apply Superfund to. That then funnels down to the so-called National Priority List or Superfund list. You have to get on this list to actually be eligible for Superfund money, which was the $1.6 billion fund we've had over the last 5 years. There's 850 sites now either on that list or proposed for that list. So you see we've got kind of a funnel here where we've gone from 23,000, 16,000 assessments, we have 850 sites on the list. Just a few more numbers and I'll get off the number kick, but I find them interesting, I hope you do. Within these 850 sites, with those and with some other sites, we've done over 600 emergency removals. One of the things that you hear a lot about Superfund is we've only cleaned up 6 sites. That's not true. We have done over 600 emergency removals where we've had to go out to sites and taken off leaking barrels, cleaned up old lagoons, the things which presented an imminent health endangerment, and there's been 600 of those. There are 13 sites which have been finally cleaned up, that have been taken off the list. We've gone through the long process, because in addition to the removals process, we have the more deliberate, longer-term process, which is developing a permanent remedy for a site, and that is a multi-year program. It's not terribly, I think, surprising, or shouldn't be, that when it takes 3 or 4 or 5 years to clean up a site, and since the program is only about that long, and since they didn't all start the first day, there's not a lot that have come out of the pipeline on the far end yet. But we have about 400 sites that we're pretty advanced in. We have engineering studies going, we're in the field with bulldozers, we're doing various things at about 400 sites. So it's a big program. I have 1,500 people working on Superfund within the federal government. There are several thousand contractors and state people in addition to that. So it's a big program with work going at many hundreds of sites and many thousand people working on the problem. So much for the process and some of the accomplishments. Let me kind of bring you up to date in terms of where we are now, because I was sworn in about 10 months ago, and what I've been doing the last 10 months in Superfund is just one giant slowdown. Ever since within 2 weeks after I was sworn in, it became apparent that Congress was not going to reauthorize Superfund on October 1 of last year, which is our fiscal year. And in fact, they have not to this date reauthorized Superfund. So what we did, Lee Thomas and I, the administrator, beginning last fall, we instituted a slowdown where we first said no new work can start at any site. And we did that for a number of months. Now we're beginning to actually peel off projects where we're going to have to stop work at various sites. This slowdown was interrupted for 2 months in April and May. We just gotten through a 2-month infusion where Congress gave us $150 million for 2 months, with the idea being that we had to spend that money by May 31. We did. We spent 149 of the 150, and we used that to ramp up the program again. We sort of took Congress at its word that they were going to reauthorize by June 1. We spent the money. We started work at 30 or 40 additional sites. We did 40 or 50 emergency removals. And a very, very important thing that, again, I think is missed in Superfund is that we got $100 million in industry promises and agreements to clean up. Superfund is an enforcement program as well as a funding program. It's a pretty tough law that allows us to go to the responsible parties and say either you clean it up or we're going to clean it up. And we've gotten about $500 million in commitments by industry and actual removals. These are contracts whereby they do the work and we oversee it. And as I say, in this recent 2-month period, we actually got $100 million in additional commitments by industry to do cleanups. So the problem is the two are linked. The enforcement and the fund are linked. Without money to threaten to clean it up ourselves, you can't get people to clean it up themselves in general. So what we've had to do is, because we haven't had money, we've kind of lost our gorilla in the closet, so to speak, or our stick, where we can tell people, if you don't clean it up, we're going to do it. And I think there's a perception that if the federal government does it, it'll take longer and cost more money, which is probably true, so industry tends to go ahead and do it. But that's kind of a snapshot. Now, I might say at this point where we are, Congress will be out again in about 5 or 6 working days from now, and they won't return again until July 18. We've got a number of tough issues still to work through. Lee Thomas and I are very disappointed at the pace at which Congress is moving on this. One thing I'd like to put a plug in, if I could, for my boss here. Lee Thomas has spent hundreds and hundreds of hours of his time on this issue. So if anybody tells you EPA doesn't want Superfund reauthorized, that's just not true. We have spent lots and lots of time working with Congress. We've tried to compromise. We do want a workable program. Some of the things that Congress has come up with, such as cleaning up cleaner than drinking water at a Superfund site, we find hard to do. We just say that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars at a site. It may not be technically feasible, and we do want to talk to you about that. But I think we've been fairly forthcoming. Lee spent, as I say, hundreds of hours of his time. He's been up meeting with the individual members over and over and over again trying to work through these issues. So the point now where there's a number of issues they still have to work through. They're trying to set the cleanup standards. They're trying to set the settlement policy with responsible parties. They're trying to work on the community right-to-know issues. And they're doing it, you know, with about one meeting every week or two. So it's going to be a while, and I guess I would just lobby you a little bit to say if you want to write your congressman, we really appreciate it, because we need this thing reauthorized. What's going to happen on about July 1, is I'm going to be writing letters to the major contractors, giving them 30 days notice of termination. We've got 3 things we're trying to juggle now. One is our own workforce, in terms of when we have to give notice to EPA employees and others. The other is our contractors. We have a couple thousand contract people who work on these programs. And finally is the actual work, which those 2 groups do. We're trying to juggle the 3 as we go along, but come July 1, it looks like we'll be sending notice to most of our contractors, as I say, giving them 30 days notice of termination. The program has been set back at, I would say, anywhere from 1 to 2 years, maybe 3 years already, and we're very disappointed, and we certainly appreciate any help you can give us in terms of getting it reauthorized. I want to make one last pitch on Superfund, and then I want to talk about some of the other hazardous waste issues. The other thing that I find very, very critical in Superfund is local involvement. I've been telling our staff that I want to treat these as real projects with real names, not just 350 of this and 200 of that. We've got to work with the communities. We've got to work with the local citizens in getting these sites cleaned up. We don't have a very good product here in some cases, in the sense that you know, we're dealing with tough alternatives. And unless you dig it all up and take it to the neighboring state, it's not very popular frequently with the local people. Now, that doesn't mean we can't clean it up. We can clean up these sites. But the kinds of cleanups are controversial. We have sites where we want to bring an incinerator on site and burn up the waste chemicals that are on that site. That's frequently not very popular. We get fought over and over again about the incinerator. If we need to haul it off to another site, the people at the other side, of course, don't want it either. So we can work through these things, but what it takes, mentioning what Mayor Knowles indicated, we've got to get involved early. And where we've been successful, frankly, is where we brought the community in early. We've talked about the alternatives. We've involved them in the alternatives and got them to have some stake in the solution. Because, as was indicated a minute ago, these are devastating problems for communities. I've got a lot of sites now where, as I told someone the other day, if it weren't for the honor, people just soon not have a Superfund site in their community. And land values go down, industrial development begins to slow up. We've got many locations now, a number in California, as a matter of fact, where people don't want a site put on the national priority list. They're saying, leave us alone, we'll clean it up. We don't want all that hassle of being a Superfund site. And my hands are sort of tied by the law. If it meets certain criteria, I've got to put it on the list. And I think in most cases that makes sense. but it is something we want to try to move faster on these sites. We want to involve the communities more, and the main thing we need to do is we need to have it get reauthorized so we can get on with it. Let me mention RCRA a second, Resources Conservation and Recovery Act. That's, as I said, the kind of cradle-to-grave system of what do you do with hazardous waste in this country. And there's a manifest system that involves tracking these materials as they go to various places. Cindy mentioned some of the transportation issues, which is a big part of the system. But the other part of it, we had some amendments to RCRA in 1984 that mandated a lot of very, very specific things we have to do. There's 38 new regulations that my shop is writing. And these are all major regulations that we've been mandated by law to write. They all have very tight time frames. Many of them have something sort of new and innovative that Congress has come up with, which is if you don't do something by a certain date, it happens anyway. And to give an example, we have a number of chemicals we have to ban from land disposal. And we have to either ban them from land disposal or we have to tell why we shouldn't. If we don't do anything, they will be banned automatically. Now, all of these chemicals, frankly, shouldn't necessarily be banned. Going to the land in a well-designed, engineered landfill, in some cases, we think is better than some of the treatment alternatives in terms of impact on health and the environment. But the law is pretty strict. And I've been beat up pretty severely in various congressional hearings lately where we've had the temerity to suggest that we shouldn't just ban it, period, because that's what Congress is telling me they meant, just ban it. The problem I've got, frankly, is that we've got a lot of sort of single-purpose things. It says ban this, don't do that, don't do this, and I'm kind of getting painted into a smaller and smaller corner in terms of what I can do. But anyway, that's one of the things we have to do is ban a lot of chemicals, some 350 or 400 chemicals from the land. Another thing I've got to do, and I think this gets even closer to the local level, we've got to regulate in some way used oil, used crankcase oil, industrial oils. This again gets into every neighborhood, every service station, every homeowner, or at least those 30 or 40 million that change their own oil. And what the law says there is that by next fall, that is November of this year, what I've got to do is decide whether to list used oil as a hazardous waste. Now there's kind of a hooker in this, because it says if you do it, you've got to pay attention to not wiping out the recycling business. We have a pretty active oil recycling business in this country, and we're trying to work through whether it's better to regulate this as a hazardous waste or to encourage recycling. And this is where, as Tony indicated, I kind of get into being sort of a regulator and a promoter all at one time because I want to solve these problems. But that's one where we've got a lot of dialogue, and the hearings I've been on that recently with the small business committees and others, there's been a lot of testimony that does not support listing used oil as a hazardous waste. It says the sort of chilling effect and the stigma of being listed as hazardous waste because of liability and other reasons tends to wipe out the recyclers. We had a guy present us in a hearing recently with a big sign from his service station that said Maryland Recycling Center, and gave it to EPA and said, you just wiped out my business of recycling because of your talk about listing this as a hazardous waste. So things get a little dramatic as you move through these. Another one I want to mention is underground storage tanks. I'm just trying to give you a flavor for these 38 regulations. We have 1 million underground storage tanks in this country, plus or minus, that relate to oil and chemicals. We are mandated by law to come up with a system of regulating those underground storage tanks. It looks like a goodly number of them are leaking. We don't have precise numbers, but a fair number, somewhere between 10, 20, 30%, kind of in that range, have a leak of one sort or the other, apparently. And this is obviously a real environmental issue. We're, again, trying to do it in such a way that the states and localities who already have programs in place will be able to continue their programs. Florida has a very active program. California has a reasonably active program. Suffolk County, New York has an extremely active program on underground storage tanks, and there are others. So we're trying to kind of come into this some way without wiping out, again, these programs. And doing something, I guess the bottom line of some of these things I'm mentioning here is we're now dealing with people who don't read the Federal Register every day. A service station dealer, a laundry and dry cleaner person who really are trying to struggle through and understand complex requirements. So this is where communication comes in again. Just to pick one last example of the 38 regs we're doing, mining waste. We got one gentleman here from Montana, and I'm getting a lot of input from Senator Baucus and others on those states with respect to mining waste. Now, we have to make a decision in about June 30th, we're talking a couple of weeks from now, which we have to decide whether to regulate mining waste as a hazardous waste. And again, there's a very prescriptive set of rules. Once you become a hazardous waste, there's a lot of things you've got to do. And that's a major issue right now with some 6 or 8 or 10 states. It's sort of a site-specific issue, because as you work through who does silver mining, who does gold mining, who does copper mining, you're talking about a relatively small number of states. Lead mining is a big issue in Missouri. You know, there's a relatively small number of states that get involved in these issues, and the question is how to do it most effectively. The final thing I want to say about RCRA is what I'm really trying to do, in addition to hopefully making these regulations understandable and working with communities on how to do it, is to increasingly at the federal level particularly understand the whole system. Because what we've got here is a big system of hazardous waste that moves around in this country. And I just have a vague feeling that if we're not careful, we're just going to move things from site A to site B. And we're just going to ban something here and it goes somewhere else. We're kind of pushing the putty under the rug one place, it comes out somewhere else. So we've all got to be cognizant of the fact that we've got to understand the implications of some of these bans and regulations, because everything's going to go somewhere in one form or the other. We hope it'll be in a more benign form, but you don't have some black box called treatment in which everything goes in and nothing comes out, because sludges come out, ash comes out of incinerators, there's sometimes air emissions, etc. So I'm all for treatment. I think treatment is very good, but we've got to understand the total implications of what we're doing. The last thing I want to mention, then we can go into the questions, chemical emergency preparedness. Cindy has mentioned some of the transportation aspects of that. We're very involved with that at EPA. We're also involved in the sort of fixed place aspect. That is a chemical plant, the Bhopal type incident that we're obviously trying to really work on in this country to avoid. We have basically a three-pronged approach to that. Lee Thomas announced about a year ago an initiative which at first was not received too well, because in effect it's a voluntary initiative. It's an initiative in which we say the federal government is going to work with localities and states and others to develop contingency plans so that individual chemical plants and communities have an idea of what to do in the case of an emergency. Part of that initiative was to issue this guidance on how to do this, and this has been out for public comment and it's going out again. And it looks to me like a lot of things are beginning to happen as either the chemical plant starts the process or the town starts the process. The other thing we did is we put out a list of 400 chemicals, which we said these particular chemicals are very acutely toxic, and this is at least an initial list to be concerned about. And in this guidance book, it explains how to knock on the door of your local chemical plant and for openers say, do you make any one of these 400 chemicals? If you do, we'd like to talk to you about contingency planning. The last thing we'll be doing in that program, and this was mentioned a number of times already today, is technical training. We're trying to develop a number of courses and others with the Department of Transportation, with the Federal Emergency Management folks and ourselves to really have an extensive training program and training materials available to help people in local fire departments, police departments, local towns, and how to come up with this. And I might just say on that aspect, on the chemical emergency business, probably the most important thing from a mayor's standpoint, in my opinion, is to develop a home for that sort of activity, whether it's your local police department or fire department, some other first responder, because these are problems which the first 20 minutes or an hour or 2 hours is critical. And what we don't want to do, in my judgment, is set in place a huge bureaucratic system with everybody kind of looking at everybody else. Because what we are concerned with right now, at least my part of it, is the true emergencies, the things which a chemical floats across a fence and can cause deaths or injuries very quickly. And the important thing from both the plant standpoint and the community standpoint is to know in that first half hour what should be done. And I think that's where the communities really come in. So that's the kind of things that I'm doing. I guess what I'm going to try to do in terms of priorities is, as I said, try to really be able to understand how these things fit together. We're going to work very hard at achieving environmental results, of trying to speed up the pace of Superfund cleanup and so forth. And I guess more than anything else, we're going to try to communicate very hard with you. I'm meeting with all the groups around the country, and I'm from my old engineering days, I really know that the action is at the local level. When you want to get a project completed, you've got to have people at that site doing that project. So we want to work closely with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Porter, both to you and Ms. Douglas. Really appreciate the very knowledgeable discussion that you've brought to this workshop. I would like to make a plug for both EPA and Department of Transportation. One, I think it's significant by your presence and your interest here today that you are committed to helping us find solutions. And that runs throughout both organizations from top to bottom. And I personally, as mayor, have had an opportunity to have discussions both with Secretary Dole and with Lee Thomas. And they're very open and very committed to getting the job done, and that I can't tell you what a difference that makes. Thank you for your notes on being a clearinghouse and voicing very well the necessity to pinpoint responsibility and to figure out who does what. And I personally will certainly make an effort to help get the Superfund redone. And I know all the other mayors that have taken an interest, and elected officials here today can maybe help spread the word. It's beyond the time that we can make any official resolutions. Are we on record for supporting Superfund funding? So as an official resolution, that has been done, but also as we can get the word out individually to help do that, I think that's critical. There's nothing of a higher priority on the national agenda than cleaning up our own backyards. So with that, let me move the microphone back over here to Mr. Porter, and we can, with Ms. Douglas and Dr. Porter, have questions and answers on how they can help.
Yes, ma'am.
I had a question, and I guess it belongs to transportation. That is putting the symbols on trucks that are carrying things with the idea that they can be very quickly identified. I'm not sure whether that is federal or state legislation, but I often hear about spills in our vicinity where it takes an awful long time to identify these things. Could you comment on that?
Yes. Okay, let's see. First of all, let me tell you what we do require at the federal level, and that is each truck has to have a plaque. Each truck carrying a hazardous material has to have a placard, and the placard, there are several. The placard has a number. There's a placard with a number, like it's 4 digits, like 1202 or something. And that is keyed to a little book that we put out called the Emergency Response Guidebook. It's yellow, and we have over 1.5 million copies out. We've tried to get a copy in every fire truck and the police cars in the United States. If I can honestly say, if you don't have one or if you're not familiar with it, let us know and we will send you, copies. We are getting ready to reprint that guidebook now, and everything. We are also, this is important, we are also getting ready to put it on a national computer system called inlets. You know, when a policeman stops you and wants to check your driver's registration or your license tag and all that to see if you're if there's a warrant out. Well, there's a national computer system that he keys into called inlets. We are putting our emergency response guidebook on inlets, so even if the policeman or the highway patrol or the fireman doesn't have the guidebook in his car or vehicle, he can immediately call in and say, I have a truck overturned. It's, the placard is placard number 1202. What is the basic emergency response to this? And they can tell him immediately what the basic emergency response is. Second of all, we require that every truck have shipping papers, and they're required to be carried either on the seat or in a pocket next to on the driver's side. And those shipping papers identify exactly what is in that truck, and obviously you want to try to get those shipping papers, and if you can get the shipping papers or the placard, what you do is you should call into this Chemtrek number, and the Chemtrek people, a man 24 hours a day, they will give you all the information they can give you on it. So the emergency responders do have immediate help if they know how to make use of the system, and we're working with the private sector and with the states to try to get this sort of training out. EPA, we're working together to try to get that information out to you. It's a part of your planning. you know, people should be able to find out immediately what is in that truck or what the basic emergency response is to that.
Thank you. Yes. I think both agencies here have displayed a pretty substantial interest in developing a partnership with the cities. And it seems to me that another part of that partnership is the compliance of federal facilities to federal law, state law, and local law. Without taking up too much of your time, I wondered if you could explain to us, since there are a number of communities here that have federal installations of some sort or other, what the responsibility of the federal agencies is or are under RCRA, both for hazardous waste and solid waste, and in terms of federal law, state law, and local ordinances, and then what enforcement mechanisms there are in place or what enforcement efforts are underway to assure that those installations do comply. Obviously, communities can do an awful lot with the people that are generating small amounts of wastes and household wastes and the dry cleaning plants and that sort of thing, but perhaps there are other efforts that need to be taken as well.
Good question, and it's one I've spent a lot of time on recently. We developed a notice in the Federal Register about 2 months ago in which we indicated, with the agreement of the other federal agencies, that federal agencies are covered by RCRA just like everybody else. That was a very important point because they didn't acknowledge that last summer. And we've now worked through and they said they are covered by RCRA just like everybody else. They also have acknowledged, that, even more importantly, they're covered by the so-called corrective action provision of RCRA, which is what you've got to clean up old RCRA-related sites as well as to operate properly in the future. A couple of other things that are going on, and I'm spending a lot of time in Colorado because there's a number of big installations in Colorado that we're working through on this issue. One of the things that we are trying to do, for example, is we're trying to authorize all the states to handle all aspects of RCRA, because what the Department of Energy and others have said is they will abide by the rules and regulations of an authorized state under RCRA. There is a dispute as to whether they will follow or they feel that they have to follow state RCRA-type laws, but they've said when someone becomes an authorized state under RCRA, they will follow that. At Rocky Flats, for example, nuclear weapons plant, we've recently signed, I think, a fairly historic agreement in which the DOE is agreed with ourselves and the state of Colorado to do a cleanup there under RCRA. And it is going to be an enforceable agreement where they will abide by the state laws with respect to that enforcement. Another thing we're working on has to do with so-called mixed waste, that is radioactive waste and RCRA waste, that is chemical waste and radioactive waste. This has been an issue where some of the federal agencies have said, in the ways, the problem we've got, without getting too technical here, is that a lot of these issues, the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and others, we have two laws, the Atomic Energy Act and the RCRA Act, which are not in concert. They have different technical answers to the problem. And so you have the same waste stream with a different solution in terms of what, and there are different technical problems. For example, in RCRA, we require every shipment that arrives at a hazardous waste site to be inspected, to be sure it's really what's in the shipment is what was on the manifest. The Atomic Energy Act goes just the other way, which says we don't want to endanger workers by opening up and looking at radioactive materials. So that's the kind of technical issue we have to work through. But I'm greatly encouraged by the way this is moving. With the Department of Energy, what I've been doing is meeting with Mary Walker, the Assistant Secretary for Environment, and we're sort of personally working through the 14 large DOE facilities. As I say, we made a big start on Rocky Flats. We're looking at some of the others right now at other parts of the country. And what we're going to do is bring those into Washington, sit down with the department heads, with all the layers in between, with the local officials and with the state, and if necessary, develop a solution on a case-by-case basis. So I think it's moving pretty well. We do have some enforceability problems as far as, for example, one of the things we're having a little trouble with is with respect to the federal budgetary process. It is very difficult for a federal agency to guarantee an expenditure, say, 4 years from now, when they go to Congress each year and get an appropriation. So we've been trying to work through how can we do that when it's sort of a political process to get your money each year. How do you guarantee a cleanup in 3 or 4 years? So we're trying to work through how to do that. But I think we made real progress, and I might say just in closing that Superfund has a lot of new teeth in it too. For example, on a Superfund cleanup at a federal facility, the EPA can make the final decision in terms of remedy. The federal agency gets the first cut at it, but if we don't agree or concur in that, then we can select a remedy at a federal facility.
Maybe, Dr. Porter, just a little bit of a follow-up on that. Does that specifically apply to Department of Defense, and I'm speaking of military installations, and even more specifically, landfills?
Yes, all federal agencies are covered by RCRA, and they have to meet the same requirements. They're all covered by Superfund, and they've got to meet those requirements. They will be. There's more teeth, as I say, in the new law than the previous law. But the Department of Defense, for example, has a budget of $300 or $400 million for cleanup, and they have what they call an installation restoration program, where they are working through these issues. And what I've asked all the federal agencies to do is within 2 months, and I did this about a month ago, to present me with a prioritization list of all their projects. So I'll be sitting down and talking to each one of them.
So is there any grandfathering of landfills that might violate EPA standards? Or are they required?
They're required to get a RCRA permit, and they're required to do corrective action if they have a prior problem, and if it's bad enough, they could get put on the Superfund list.
I'd like to comment briefly on a comment that Mayor Wagner made just a few moments ago, speaking as a private company, as a vendor. And that was his call for the EPA to say, well, look, if waste to energy is a good way of disposing of waste, that the EPA should say so. We hear that coming up more and more out in the private sector. As you are undoubtedly aware, there's a tremendous controversy out in the many communities about the safety of waste disposal, including waste to energy plants. And there seems to be a vacuum there, and who do you turn to? I think people normally tend to turn to a governmental entity somewhere to tell us, is it safe or is it not? That doesn't seem to be coming from the federal government at this time, and although I understand that the EPA is undertaking a review. And actually, I think it's because of that lack of information from an official source that has given rise to the Conference of Mayors establishing CORE, C-O-R-R-E, and which my company enthusiastically supports. It's an attempt by the Conference of Mayors to engender a scientific dialogue and a scientific study of the environmental effects of, for instance, waste to energy plants, so that the Conference of Mayors will end up being a disseminator of information that the mayors and other elected officials can rely on when they make these decisions. I'd like to get your comment, Mr. Porter, just a little bit on what's the appropriate role of the EPA in a situation like this, where municipalities are striving for solutions and where you have community groups saying, hey, this is the wrong way to go, this is environmentally disadvantageous.
Okay, first let me start with the RCRA bias given to us by Congress is against land disposal. I mean, this runs all through the law, that land disposal is bad, treatment is good. I'm not saying that in every conceivable circumstance I personally agree with that, but that certainly is something we're trying to reflect. And I think in general it's a pretty good direction, that they're saying that things are being banned from the land, we don't want to create future Superfund sites, and we want to move towards some kind of treatment. We have, I think, generally said that a well-run municipal waste combustor is a pretty good idea in many cases. We've got to be very careful because we're also a regulator. You know, so we have a little hard time making blanket endorsements, and we're certainly not going to make site-specific endorsements. But what we are doing, for example, on municipal waste combustion units for solid waste, is we're doing a study now, which will be out by the end of the year, which will pull together everything we know at this point on municipal waste combustion, and particularly with respect to dioxins. We're trying to pull together all the scientific information on dioxins, all the things we know from our study of waste-to-energy type facilities, and put them down in what I'm calling a comprehensive report. It'll be out early next year. And in this, we will be telling the world what we know about those kind of devices. Now, this won't solve all our problems, but it'll certainly, we think, show people what we know and what we don't know. And I think generally we're supportive of these devices. I think we've already said that a well-run municipal incinerator does not, we don't think, create a problem with respect to dioxin. That's not a unanimous view, even within EPA. That's my view, and we're going to be trying to work through that over the next few months. But as I say, we're still regulators, and we can't obviously endorse any one technology. We have to work through, and what I want to have is a range of technologies that we can use. And I think as we move through this study, we're going to be able to pull together everything we know in that. I hope it'll be helpful.
Thank you very
question. Mayor Van Arnstead.
Yeah, Mayor, I'd like to have someone talk to the railroad problem. It may not be a problem. There may be rules governing railroads, but railroads are an arm's length away from local governments. You know, we can stop trucks and so forth, but train going down the track, that's a little difficult to get to, you know. So are there special rules involving the railroads? Who polices them?
Yeah, there are. The Department of Transportation has a number of rules for the railroads on we have within my agency we have a lot of rules on the packaging of the hazardous material in the rail tank car and that sort of thing. The FRA has rules about when you go through cities, the number of miles per hour you can go. It has rules on the drinking and drugs on the operation of the train, and it has a variety of safety rules. And the FRA is primarily responsible for the inspection of the track and the inspection of the trains.
So we would call DOT if there was a problem that would come up with Mayor Van.
If you had a hazardous material transportation question or concern, you can call, RSPA. And if you have just a general railroad issue, you could call us. We'll get you in touch with the right people. But if it's a general railroad issue, you'd probably just want to call the FRA. John Riley's the administrator, and.
Thank you very much, Mayor Wagner, and then Mayor O'Toole.
Yeah, I'd just like to go back to Mr. Porter with the question that was raised before and the question that was raised by Mrs. Reinerson with regards to liability. I think that we're in a situation where there are areas here where the private sector could get involved and get involved very effectively in solving some of these problems. But the kind of hedging that, in effect, that you just gave us with regards to the question about coming out and supporting certain technologies or not supporting certain technologies is exactly the kinds of things that are, in effect, paralyzing this whole area. And it comes down to the question of liability. Private companies are not going to get involved in the area if the concern is that 10 or 15 years from now, something which is absolutely not known at the present time as being a problem in this area, it may crop up, and the liability and their liability that they have at that point in time may in fact destroy them. So in effect, they're staying away from this area. So what is being done with the question of liability at the federal level? Because I think that's basically where the problem has to be resolved.
I was hoping I'd get through at least one session without talking about liability insurance, but I guess I couldn't escape it. Let me approach on a couple of levels. First is all of you know, we have a tremendous problem in this country now in liability insurance and tort claims and so forth. It's much bigger than my part of EPA. It's much bigger than EPA. It has to do with medical malpractice, all kinds of things. I'm not trying to duck the issue, but it's a very big issue with respect to what juries are awarding in terms of the very broad view of liability. So as you know, many states are moving to try to do something about that at the state level by either limiting, and I'm not necessarily promoting this or endorsing it, but there's things like limits on awards, limits on attorney's fees. They're looking at joint and several liability. They're doing all kinds of things. We're looking at the federal level. The president has suggested some stuff along some of those lines in terms of federal legislation on the overall liability issue. Whether we get through Congress, I don't know. So I think that you got to start by assuming we have a large national problem, as Time Magazine pointed out recently, and others, on liability in this country. Now, getting more specific, within my shop, we're doing a couple of things. Within Superfund, we do indemnify contractors who do Superfund cleanups. They're indemnified by the federal government when they're working on a Superfund site. So that's one small piece of it. We have resisted sort of unlimited indemnification because, frankly, we don't want to create sort of the ultimate deep pockets, i.e. the federal government, so that, you know, you've really got a target for people to sue. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg aspect here. The bigger you make the target, apparently, the more lawsuits you get. With respect to individual technology, let me go back to what I said a second ago about municipal waste combustors. If I could go one step further, what we have found is that a well-operated municipal waste combustor does not produce significant amounts of dioxin. It's very hard for me to say this particular unit will be well operated for 30 years or 10 years or whatever. So we have to caveat our what we say just a little bit. But I think that's an interesting technology. We think there's other interesting technologies, but I don't think you're going to get the federal government to endorse a technology irrespective of how it's operated. So it's very hard for us to make blanket endorsements of any technology.
What about the question, though, about something which is just simply isn't known at the present time, and that liability then coming back to bite the operator at some time in the future? There's concern about that, and there isn't any kind of protection in that kind of an area.
I don't have the answer to that. I think that gets back to the whole, you know, as I say, system of liability and jury awards and so forth. That you know, it's like a guy said to me the other day that's in the machine tool business. He said, we have machines out there that are 50 or 60 years old, and they've had no problem for 50 or 60 years, but the minute we do, we're going to get sued under today's laws. And it sounds unfair to me. I wish I had the answer, but that's the society we're living in right now. And as I say, I think the only way to approach that is not that EPA can somehow guarantee something forever, but we've got to approach it either on a broader look at our liability laws. And I just think, you know, it's risky to be in business these days, but people are staying in business, so I, you know, that's one thing I want to do, for example, in our programs, is I want to be sure we've got plenty of competition, because people want to do these projects. We're not having a huge problem getting people to bid on Superfund work. They all moan and groan a lot about liability, and I'm sympathetic to them, but we still get people that are willing to do the work. It's risky. I was in the engineering business. I know it's risky, and I wish there was some simple answer, but I just don't see one at this time, other than society taking a look at the way that these kind of awards are done in terms of our overall jury and jurisprudence system and the way insurance is run. But I don't think there's something that EPA can do, because it's a much bigger problem than EPA.
Thank you. Mayor O'Toole?
Actually, I had two questions. One was going to be about liability insurance, so
we can always revisit that if you like.
Well, just one comment, though. In the third quarter of 1984, which was kind of the watershed of the insurance industry, it's when everything started to turn around. Environmental impairment liability was the first form of liability that the insurance industry checked out on. I mean, they don't write it. They won't. They've changed all their comprehensive general liability forms to exclude sudden and accidental. I mean, they have taken every step they can possibly take to get out of the environmental business. And I really think that that it's going to be the last one that they get back into when the market turns around. There's going to be a wide gap where they're not going to be involved. And they may never be involved unless some leadership is taken with regards to defining the limits of liability and some regulate in some ways the method by which insurance companies must pay out on environmental awards. So I would encourage EPA to address that issue from a national level, because I really think it's important to get the private sector involved.
Yeah, let me just make one quick comment. I don't want you to leave you the impression we're doing nothing. One of the things, the reason the insurance companies, among other things, are nervous about hazardous waste is the uncertainty. I mean, and the companies who wonder if they're going to have kind of open-ended liability on, say, a Superfund claim. So we're trying to work with the insurance industry to get them to better understand what's involved with the cleanup. It's not an unlimited thing in general. We've spent $1.5 billion in this country in the last 5 years. I have $90 million left from the original Superfund at this point. So that tends to lead me to believe, and we're working at several hundred sites, that these are not multi-billion-dollar projects. What I think they're more concerned about are citizen suits based on health effects and things of that nature, which again is very hard for me to solve. But we are trying to bring more certainty to the regs. We're trying to help them to understand what's going on with respect to cleanups. The other thing I might just say real quickly is that I'm beginning to see a lot of interesting things happen. For example, the Hazardous Waste Treatment Council and the chemical treatment kind of companies are beginning to band together and form pools to farm insurance. And I've noticed a little bit of uneasiness in the form of some insurance companies that some of the work is tending to go to some of these pools. So what I'm hoping is they begin to see this business disappearing over the horizon, that maybe they won't stay out of it forever.
I had one other
Didn't mean to interrupt you.
and more in terms of Ms. Douglas. California has recently had a very graphic and tragic example of double licensing, which you briefly touched on, and you mentioned that it, under the upcoming regulations, as I recall, you'd be prohibiting that. What are you doing other than prohibiting it? What kind of enforcement mechanisms are you putting in place to prohibit double?
Okay, this is an area I'm going to speak very generally on because the Congress some years ago, in fact, when I was on the Commerce Committee, passed a law related to the National Driver Register. The idea of in fact, all drivers in all states reporting into a National Driver Register, to a switching computer, or there are a number of different ways you can do it, and including all drivers, including truck drivers and hazardous materials truck drivers. So that responsibility to try to work all of that out is with NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and they were told it gets extremely complicated because all the states do licensing, of course, right now, and they have the standards for who gets a license and what an unsafe driver is versus a reckless driver versus, and so such a system would sort of end up, there are concerns about what the standard should be. Should there be a standard, or should there just be a switching system? And they've established a council, an advisory council composed of state people and local people, and the Teamsters, have an interest because of privacy, and insurance companies have an interest, and who should have access to that information you're talking about. It gets extremely complicated, and they're trying to work out the computer equipment, the practical application of the whole thing, and all the privacy questions, and it's coming along, but I wish it would happen faster. I'm not exactly sure where it is, but I'm told that, it's coming. It's coming along.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes, Mary.
I'd like to ask Mr. Porter what the EPA is doing, if anything, with the agricultural pollution problem in the United States.
Okay, that's not my area per se, but I'll give you the best answer I can. I think there's a number of things. One of the things we're doing now is we're looking, Jack Moore, who's the assistant administrator under pesticides and toxic waste, is doing a nationwide study of pesticides and herbicides that are applied to the land and the impact on groundwater. So that's one thing we're doing to see if more work is needed there. The Water Office is also looking, or has looked on an ongoing basis at so-called non-point sources, which includes agriculture runoff. I don't think there's anything real imminent in that, but we're trying to look at the agricultural situation from a number of angles. In my shop, that is in Superfund, we've been trying to work through whether sites should be put on the Superfund list that have pesticide applications. We have not been able to work it out yet, and it looks like it's very hard to do. You don't really want to declare the state of Kansas as a Superfund site, or the state of Nebraska, or whatever. So we're trying to work out how can you more narrowly focus those kind of regulations. It's a big issue, and of course superimposed on everything else is the plight of the farmer right now in terms of how do you work through something which is at all cost effective.
Are you working with any of the farm organizations?
Yeah, we are. We're working with a number of them, and particularly in our pesticides type studies. Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, sir.
I'm coming from Germany. I'm sorry because my English is not very good, but I'm very interested about these problems here in America. We are going by a studying tour through the states, and I think the American states are far away, very far away from the high technology situation in Europe, in Germany too. I will find the reason why this so is. I can understand America is a very great state, and in every time in front of space and so on, and in waste they are very behind, I think so, in communities behind another states in Europe, I think. And in Germany there is a great discussion. Since 1970 there was a social party, a social democratic party. They was in government, and they give a new resolution for waste and another things, and they make law and order 1974 since and today, until today. And I will ask you why the discussion in America in communities so late, and why the waste only by companies and privately companies taken away. I think it's very dangerous. I give you an example, a little example. We have our people in all communities wake up, yes, and a great discussion everywhere, and they're going recycling and so on. And the example are the newspapers. We are collecting newspapers by companies privately, and the market is down now. Many companies, they make business, and now is the market down. And the result is no interesting. What are you doing? The communities must going the way, that way are going before the privately companies. And I think it's very dangerous with all waste, this given by only by privately companies. I think it's very good. So in Germany, and in another European states, when the government give law and order for all states. We have 11 states in Germany, and the United States are 50, more difficult, I think. And for me as a German, it's very interesting, the discussion today and the discussion in towns as Washington, New York, Seattle and so on, and in Vancouver too, and in San Francisco, what you are doing, or what the government take initiative, to take the problem away, to make the problem smaller and smaller. This is my question, okay. And sorry about my English.
Okay. Well, let me just react to a couple of those points. First off, there are some areas where I think Europe is ahead of us on some aspects of hazardous waste management. We are spending a lot of time, for example, looking at what Europe is doing on underground storage tanks. We spent a lot of time looking at France and Germany and other places. Now, I might say, by the way, it's not unanimous. When you look at what they're doing many different things. When you look at what major oil companies are doing, they're doing many different things. When you look at what the states are doing, they're doing different things. Some are going to secondary containment, some are going to various kinds of leak detection devices, others are going to inventory control, and on and on and on. So that's just one thing where we're trying to learn. Europe has been doing it longer than we have. I'm not sure they've solved the problem, but because they're going different ways and we're looking at it. With respect to recycling and source control, which I think is part of your comment too, this is an area we're very interested in, and I'm seeing a lot more of with respect to industry. About 90% of hazardous waste is handled on the site of the company, of the various companies involved. So we're not sure it's always handled properly, but it's handled. And one of the things that we're trying to do is get a better sense of why we can't do more recycle and source control. One of the things that I think is happening just is the sheer cost of hazardous waste disposal goes up, and liability insurance is part of that, by the way, that people are tending to do much more source control and recycle. We're finding, for example, at some of the incinerators, that the material going to the incinerator, the solvents or whatever that are being burned, are much more concentrated and much dirtier, meaning they're being recycled a number of times before they go to be finally disposed of. So there's a lot of information developing that people are doing that. We have a study coming out this fall on waste minimization, in which we're trying to pull together everything we can around the country with respect to what are people doing to minimize hazardous waste. And I think we're doing a fair amount, but we could certainly be doing a lot more.
May I just give another comment to this gentleman here? The answer I submit is perhaps even a little bit more fundamental than that. In Germany and many other European countries, they have a parliamentary form of government. Once a certain party comes into power, they can do whatever they want. If the Social Democratic Party wants to enact a series of regulations, they are enacted because they're the party in control. In the United States, with a legislative system, oftentimes the administration doesn't control its own Congress. And we've seen that in the previous administration, and we see it in this administration where we have one party in control of one house of the legislature and another party in control of another. And in point of fact, the ruling party can't get anything done unless you have a very strict consensus on a very narrow range of issues. Whether that's better or worse, I don't know, but it's a fact of life in America. And you couple that with our traditional, very strong states' rights system, and we fought a war over it a century ago. Those two things, I think, indicate to you the tremendous resistance you have in having a consensus immediately achieved and having people say, well, this is what we have to do.
Thank you very much. As mayors, of course, we don't know anything about that because we're always in control. and with that, yes, Mayor Messinger.
Following up on the reference to recycling, if I understood what our friend from Germany was saying, he was suggesting that simply because the marketplace makes recycling unprofitable, we tend in this country to abandon it at that point, whereas I gather in his country the government sees that regardless of the marketplace, recycling is accomplished. I'm under the impression that because removal of non-combustibles is really very important to waste-to-energy projects, that recycling finally is getting some financial support that it has lacked in the past, and that we will have a more stable base to assure that recyclables are removed. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's generally true. I think it still comes down to where you folks live. If you've got it, you still have to deal with a voter who may or may not want to take things out of their garbage. There's been a number of people who lost elections in this country over that issue. I'm all for it. I would love to see more recycling. I'd love to see more source control. I'd love to see more of resource recovery kind of projects. But you still got to work it through the political process. There's got to be the will to do it. And I do think there is a buck to be made here, and I think people are trying to make a buck at it, but whether we can impose it is going to be a little more difficult.
Let me, just before there's any more discussion, Ms. Douglas has to go catch an airplane, so I would like to officially thank Dr. Porter and Ms. Douglas for their very informative discussion. I'd like to thank Rita Calvin from EPA, who is also here, and this has been a great workshop. I think a number of people would still be free to answer questions and make discussions, but I wanted to officially let you all get back to your respective positions. And thank you so much for the outreaching your hand to help out. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I can stay a few more minutes if anybody's got any more questions. Did you want to ask something?
Well, I wanted to respond to our friend from Germany. I think there's something else, too, that hasn't been touched on. I think that America and Americans were so used to having so much land and just time to move on for so many years that there would always be a fresh place to start, that they didn't practice conservation the way that Europeans have for many years. And what is going to happen, as we know at the local level, is as we try to dispose of waste, whether it's solid waste or hazardous waste, and we have to take it farther away, and it's harder and harder to find a place. It becomes more expensive, And when people find that it becomes so expensive, then perhaps they will begin to realize that they have to do something about it. Plus, we are more environmentally aware than we have ever been. It just takes longer.
I had another question. This problem waste have many facts at the basis. We must find the facts. What are you doing, or what are the states are doing, the government are doing in the United States to speak with the industry? They are producing the most waste. And this is a great discussion in our country too. We are thinking we need a law and order that we can say the industry don't make so many, I don't know the word now. Do you know, when you go in a shopping, or when you go shopping, you buy something, there's many, yes, and this is the problem. What will you do with them? We have an idea in Germany, great and high technology, waste burning. But many scientists are saying this is not good for the air and for the health from all people in which town ever. And this is a problem too. What is in the United States, or what are the United States are doing? Sometimes that the problem will be small in future.
Well, let me mention a couple of things. First off, within EPA, we have a registration of new chemicals, which is a very long process. If someone is going to make a chemical which is going to be hazardous in some way or toxic in some way, there's a long registration process you have to go through and talk about the effects of that chemical. Many chemicals are never made for that reason. With respect to packaging, that's a more difficult problem because, again, it's very difficult to tell society without, again, the political will to do it, that you won't use certain packages. We have attacked a number of issues in that regard. Phosphates is just one example. Lead in gasoline is another example where we've taken lead or are taking lead out of gasoline. So I think we're moving on those issues on a number of fronts, but this is a very inventive country and there's a lot of things going on, and frankly there's not unanimity on these issues in some cases. I mean, if you've ever fought a bottle law, you know about that. It's not unanimous. It may be unanimous in this room, but I can assure you it's not unanimous when you get out in the community.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you all very much. It's been a great meeting. Appreciate it. Thank you.
That concludes our coverage of this workshop on hazardous waste, recorded at this year's 54th Annual Meeting of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. For more coverage from this meeting, tune in again tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 Pacific, when the city leaders discuss urban crime.